Get started at 7 o'clock. Might as well start on time. So anyway, my name is Bob. Also, I'm a member of BYOC up in New Rochelle here in New York. And my problem, as I always say, is Bob. Okay. So the main thing is now, the topic is like spiritual awakening now. Again, spiritual awakening now. I just don't understand why, when we do this program, step 12 talks about having had that spiritual awakening. We really don't have to wait around for it. Sometimes I hear people say they 5 years, 10 years, 20 years are still working on the problem, but we're hearing the solution and doing these steps in this work here now, we can have that spiritual awakening right now towards our addiction to alcohol, towards our addiction to food. The way we think is what the problem is. It's all in our thinking. So we can have that shift, change of thinking towards our addiction, towards life in general. And it just seems when we work this program through a spiritual program and awakening, we can have that shift right here, right now. It's called the transformation, it's called the shift. But let me get into it right away. And this is what happened to Bill, right? And this explains what happens when we're in the self. So here's what Bill says. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in the bitter morass of self-pity. Right. So Bill was in the self, the whole beginning of Bill's story, he talks about, he was wanted to be a famous golfer. He wanted to be big in finance and all of these different things. So Bill was sort of what we call into the self. So here he says again, and then he goes on to say, quicksand stretched all around me in all directions. So in my life, before I came into this program, before I worked these steps, before I had that spiritual awakening, quicksand was around me, all around me. The quicksand was depression. It was anxiety. It was fear, self-centered fear. Again, the topic is the spiritual awakening now. We don't really have, it's amazing when we really work this program and work these steps, we don't have to wait for the spiritual awakening. We work these steps and it just comes to us by having that higher consciousness, getting out of the self. The self is all about the ego. So Bill goes on to say, um, I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. So in our lives, I was joking around before about vices. I thought someone said devices, but it talked about they were changing. But actually, we have all of these vices. I mean, when we come into this program and it promises us in Bill's story, it says the answer to all my problems. So whether it's with the food, and I talk about the water, having that change of perception, the change in perception of spiritual awakening as far as life, people, we stop fighting life. We stop fighting everything. I have a few quotes here. Here's one quote that I have for the meeting. To the mind that is still, the whole world surrenders. So when we look at Bill's mind, Bill is explaining to me, myself, and I'm sure many of us here today, if you're in depression, you're upset, Bill talked about the self-pity, the word self, the morass, and the alcohol was my master. So it can be the food, it can be the alcohol, the drugs, but definitely people, but it's all related. The food and the alcohol about our relationship to life and life and people is related to our addiction to food and alcohol. It's all the same thing. But what does it mean? What is it from? We're going to learn here. It says, and then Bill goes on to say, this is on page 8 in Bill's story, by the way, if anybody's following. On page 8, it says, I was soon to be catapulted in what I was to call the fourth dimension of existence. Okay, how many times have I read this? How many times I just intellectually, but it is telling us here we could be catapulted in the fourth dimension, right? The fourth dimension is being out of this time, as it's called. It's being in the, I would say that the present, being here in the present and now, because the past is anxiety, is depression, and the future is anxiety. So we have a choice in life, and we can become, and through these steps, we become spiritual awakening. One more thing I just want to say about that is that people say, well, I'm trying not to think of the past. I'm trying not to think of the future. But when we understand the truth from the false, as it says here, know the truth and it will set you free in life, because the truth is the past isn't us. The past is a past. It may be an illusion, something somebody told us how to live life, our parents or people, the society made us think a certain way. But that's where the depression comes from. And, then I wondered why I was depressed. I was living in the past and I was living in regretting the future, or I was planning the past. So here Bill goes on to say that he was soon to be catapulted in that other dimension. In this book, it talks about that a few times, in there is a solution. Again, why do they call it that chapter? There is a solution. It talks about that transformation. It says ideas and emotions and all this thinking changes. Again, with our addictions, a lot of times they relate it to the food because that's a big problem, right? We were brainwashed by the corporations, by society. When we grew up as kids, we had all of this crazy, crazy food. But the consciousness comes in when we have a higher consciousness, as we talk about what Bill gets here, because Bill had this transformation towards people, towards life in general. Here he was ready to, the jumping off point, he was ready to kill himself. And right here, we're going to talk about, again, the topic is spiritual awakening now. So reading these few pages here, we can have that spiritual awakening now. So if you're really upset, if you woke up and you're in fear, if you're worried about something today, that transformation we can have here and now. We can have that transformation in thinking by working these steps. It's in the steps. Spiritual awakening now. What does step 12 says? Having had that spiritual awakening. So, I mean, many of you, it's not like you came in today to the program. You've been in here how many years, right? And how many times have I gone to meetings and we're either in the problem or the solution? When I first came in, I was always in the problem. I was in like Bill was here. He was thinking the problem. I was in the quicksand. I was overwhelmed because my thinking was from the self, selfishness, self-centeredness. And he uses the word self-pity. It's all about the self, to forget the self is to find yourself. And I had another quote here. Again, the mind that created the problem cannot fix it. I love this quote. So we come in here, our best thinking God is here. And I had read also, to forget oneself is to be aware of all things. So here's what Bill, this is the transformation. I just want to set it up a little bit. So this is what Bill was in the self morass, the pity, the shame, the guilt, the resentment, all of these defects of character, right? Which is programmed, God will cast out when we get in his consciousness. So here we go. So here we have the problem Bill's in, and right away we're going to get to what's called the solution. So I don't know, do we want to talk about more about Bill's problem? The problem we know about, the problem we all know. We know the problem. How many times we talked about it? But the more we talk about the problem, guess what happens? We're making it real. If I say, look what somebody said to me, look what they did to me, then it becomes a reality, right? Because they're coming from the self-centered self. We can rise, it says in here, above our problems. But let me not spoil the story for you and read on here because I don't want to give you the ending here. I was soon to be catapulted, he says. I was to know happiness, peace, and a useful way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Here he was in morass and bitterness and death. He wanted to kill himself. The story is he was on the second floor. He had to bring his mattress down to the first floor. He was afraid he was going to jump out the window. So here he was. I could relate to this in my life when I came in. And also when I came in and I didn't work these steps and have that spiritual solution on my own intellect, if a better philosophy of life or better morals could cure us, we would have the answer long ago. I had shelves full of self-help books. I mean, it's just amazing. But again, let's have that spiritual awakening now as the topic is. So that's our topic. So he goes on to say, here's when Ebby comes in. So here we see right away, when you go to meetings and you meet people, and this you can see a difference. It's called a transformation, the grace of a higher power. And he says on page 9, in the middle of the page, the door opened and there he stood, fresh skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? So here we're sitting in all this being upset all day, but it says here we can have that transformation, explicably different. Something changed. And then he asked him what happened, and he simply looked at him and said, I got religion. So what happened to Ebby? Here he says, I got religion. He had that transformation, a spiritual transformation through a God of his understanding, a higher power. He found out that he can transform his thinking. He also realized, most probably, and like Bill's starting to realize, that our thinking is insane. When we come from the self, it's because, you know why? It's insanity, because it's not true. If I was to think of somebody did something to me 20, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, or even yesterday, they may have been insane for treating me a certain way, but how insane? Who was the insane one? I was the insane one for carrying it around. So step 2 said we had to be restored to sanity. Again, with our addictions, okay, let's talk about for a minute with the food. We had to be restored to sanity. How insane is it to eat like products that have 25 chemicals or 50 chemicals in them? They're mostly there to generate our weight, oil and sugar and all of these things and fat. And the same with, well, forget about the drugs and the alcohol. That's all feeding the ego. What happens with the food or the alcohol, the drugs, the ego says, wow, this is great. I have a solution, but it's only what's called a momentary pleasure. And when pleasure, okay, when you say have a great time, you go on a yacht and you say, wow, this is great. On the other side of pleasure is always pain. Because when your next day, when you have to go back to work and you compare it to that pleasure. But we want here we have a chance, to get the ultimate blissful happiness, enjoyment. And they talk about it here. I was soon to be catapulted, he says, Bill. I would know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that gets more incredibly. The miracle, the grace of God came into his life. That transformation. We had to be transformed because our thinking, you see, what happened was God gave us this high way of thinking. It's an intelligence, right? But we misused it. Self-will run riot. We just made a decision when we were young. Say somebody looked at us the wrong way, said something to us, then somebody says, well, I had, you got to understand how traumatic my experience was. No doubt about it. There's traumatic experiences in life, but 95% of the things that we fret about and are upset about is not. It has to do with, somebody calls us a name and we made that decision back then, that a decision about the self. But when we were little children, we didn't care. We went around, you see children playing, they're happy, joyous, and free. It's only when we made that decision. Now the transformation comes when we get rid of that old self, that old decision making, the defects of character, the resentment, the anger, the guilt, the jealousy, right? The envy, related to the 7 deadly sins, the gluttony. One day we made a decision. Not everybody does, but we did. With alcohol, we made that decision. It was God. It was our solution. With the food, we made that decision. We made these decisions. So when it says the inventory is ours, it's always us, right? We always got to look at us because, it says on acceptance, it says it's not so much the things I have to change in the world, the last sentence on page 417, but the things I have to change in me and myself. The way out of this whole thing is in. The way out of this whole thing with the food is in. Not to look at all the food and corporations, and even the government portrays the people on the Food Drug Administration are 100% from the corporations. To make our own decision, no matter how unpopular, because society's decisions about life to become more successful, more money, more material, these are all things of the flesh. These are things that come from materialism. And the more you get, the more you want, and never satisfied. It's a momentary pleasure. And our whole outlook towards our addictions can't be one of trying. Here's another thing too, trying to resist it. When we try to resist any of our emotions, then we resist them, gives them more power. If I say, I'm not going to be angry now, not going to be resentful, I'm not going to be depressed, I'm not going to be anxious. No, we could take our emotions in and become friends with them and observe them, right? And be in the present and just say, well, there's an emotion, but it's all based on falseness. It's not true. If I'm thinking about a long lost love, if I'm thinking about what somebody said to me, that's insanity. That's not the truth. The truth is, the God-given truth is through we're creating God's image. I mean, our body's God's temple. So when we have that transformation, it could lead to life, food, drugs, alcohol, and people, and the insanity of wanting material things, because that's falseness. So during the day, if I'm upset, I just know it's not true. But let me read on here what happened in Bill's story. So so Ebby says, look, I got religion. They had told him on the bottom of page 9 of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. That was 2 months ago. It wasn't like 20, 30, 40 years ago. And the result was self-evident. It worked. So in step 12, when we want to, like, say, sponsor people, we want to go to whatever we do in life. So we have to, that the thing is that on that point of view, in order to be a perfect example, and the only way to show somebody something is to teach them, is to be an example of it. There is really no other way around it and to do it. So anyway, he told him about this practical application. And on page 11, it says, in the middle of the page, but my friend sat before me and he made the point blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. Doesn't that say it all? His human will had failed. We, step one says we're powerless. The whole step one is the whole program. That's my human will. And why does it fail? Because step two tells me I'm insane. And the reason I know I'm insane is because I'm happy. I'm unhappy. I'm depressed. I'm fearful. That's not true. Just understand that during the day, when you have these emotions about the past, it's not true. You're coming from, you know why? There could be 10 people in the room and you know, they might all be happy about a situation that happened there, and you're the one who's upset. You know, so we have this insane way of thinking. And when we realize the insanity, that is the way. I didn't know where the problem was. And when I started to realize the problem was me towards my addictions, towards life in general. So um, that floored me in a Bonner page 11. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. So when we talk about religion in this program, this is one thing I want to say. For people coming into the rooms, it's more like in our program, it's a philosophy. Now, there have been religions, and there are billions of people in this world who believe in religions and spirituality and meditation and all of these practices. Why do you think they do that? That's because they have nothing better to do with their lives. But when you see people immersed in the spirituality, which is what religions and philosophy, even the ancient Greek philosophies were based on these principles of a different, you know, see, the thing is, they found out that we have this resource in us. We just bury it. We bury the sunlight of spirit. So we have this resource to be happy, joyous, and free. And the way we know it is when we let go of all of the self. And that's what the steps do, is really deflating the ego, deflating the self. We're happy. We can't help it but be happy. We can't help it but be joyous and happy and ecstatic. And again, like I say, a little child is, until they make up their mind that they're going to come from the self. And also, I always use this example, is that like a puppy dog will, you know, it's always, every day, it's life's the most happiest day, because we were blessed with this intelligence. But like everything else in life that's good, it could be with our food, the alcohol. We have all these good things around us, but we misuse it, right? We take it upon ourselves that's the, we make it a higher power. Then that becomes finite. We lose all touch with all the awareness. If you forget the self, the whole world comes to you and it opens up. You're not isolated anymore. You're thinking of, you walk out, you're thinking of beauty in everything and everyone, because God is all, it's the energy. You know, it could be God, the energy of the universe, spirit of the universe, the energy, and a lot of other philosophies, and around the world, they talk about this universal energy. They talk about seeing the energy in everything, even inanimate objects that, you know, so, you know, it's really interesting. I was reading about something, and they said, it was saying, was like, in, you know, on a blade of grass, the dew, you know, like a wet spot of dew, you can, the whole universe is reflected in that one thing. So when we become centered, we become one, and we get out of the ego, we become joined. We're every time, you know, with our addictions, with the food, what do? You go home and you close the shades, and it's all about finite, right? That's why a lot of, even this time of year, you know, people fast. The reason they do that, again, I'm not saying how people should do this, and I'm not telling people what to do, but I'm saying that there's a reason, because it was called gluttony. It's a reason, even with lust, why people abstain from certain things, because it's bringing them back to the flesh. Now, we could go out and enjoy the world, but if we have the comprehension that it's all false, everything we really see is false, because we're seeing it from our perception. We're the prison of what society told us as we grew up. But this is what the steps are all about. Okay, that's step three. You know, when we go into, we're insane in step two. Step three, obviously, Ebby started, he just let himself and surrendered to the world, the energy, a higher power, God. And then he got out of himself. When he walked into the room and he saw this man change, his eyes change. Ebby wasn't coming in the room thinking about himself. Just like when we walk into a meeting, we're thinking of ourselves. Everybody is thinking of themselves. But in order to, and that's where we become unhappy, depressed. If only everybody would like me. And no, that's not, the answer isn't there. The answer isn't in more success, more money. And this is what he talks about, because it says his human will had failed. And of course, he says on the bottom of page 11, So for people coming in and they see this like a spiritual, religious, or the word God, it says here, and the reason, okay, let me read. This floored me. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. Here was something at work in the human heart which had done the impossible, like a miracle. My ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Now, let me tell you the story. I've told it before, but here it is. There's a lecture, right? They're having a debate. And one of the guys up there, the debate was between a person who was an atheist and a person who had belief in God. So so they had a question period, or you could say what you want. So one guy comes up to the podium and he says, look, since I had this belief in my faith, and I really have this tremendous belief, my life is great. My everything is just beautiful. I'm happy, I'm joyous, I'm free, like we have in our program here. So he just says it's so great and everything. So the other guy who was debating with the atheist said to the atheist, see here, there's your proof for you, because it works. So my life, it works. I don't need any other proof. And that's what Bill says here. He says he thought that this religion thing works, this spirituality works. And he saw here sat a miracle directly across the kitchen table. He shouted great tidings. So if we sponsor people and we work this, and it talks about working with others, about the newcomer coming in, it says in that one paragraph there, it talks about having, show him the spirituality and steps. Let me just, let me get to that in working with others. On page 100, okay? So this is what they tell you to do with a newcomer, right? But how about us old comers here who've been here for years, and you in meetings you hear people, they're telling you to do this with the new man. But is somebody who's been in this program 20, 30 years, like, I mean, I was in for a while, and then I had picked up these steps. But it's telling you here what to do with the new man. But I'm just saying, I just think that people should do this with the old man if they're irritable, restless, and discontent, and they're a dry drunk or whatever, and they haven't come to terms with this. Here's what they do on page 100. Both you and the new man must walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. So here he's telling a guy's walking in the door. He's starting to work with him, and he says, "You must walk in the path of spiritual progress." That's what step 12 tells us in all our affairs. So this is a simple program, but here's a concept that I think that many of us here who read this don't still haven't come to that point. That's why I say spiritual awakening now. We can have it right here, right now. When we let go of the self, we can be transformed. We can be happy. Just pick up these steps and understand, we always fail, even like step 4. We have all our defects of character. It could be the 7 deadly sins, as Bill talks about, the envy, the anger, sloth, lust, all of these things. Pride is the main one, the self-centered pride. Selfishness and self-centeredness, as it says on page 62. It also says there the problems of our own making, which we discussed earlier, that how if we have a problem, if we have an addiction, it's our thinking in our brain that's the problem. So, and wait, let me just get back to that. With the addiction, we can't control it. Again, diets, I always say diets don't work, because whenever we try to control people in situations, it doesn't work. We need that transformation. So can you imagine, like I always say, I'm going to bring it up again, like with the water. You know how many calories, what differences will make in your life when you realize the beauty, and this is created by God, rather than having all of these crazy drinks. They could have like 1,200. It could be in one drink could be the amount of calories you should have in one day. But that's false. That's what we told by the advertisement on TVs, the internet. The transformation. Don't try not to have that drink in front of you, but look at it different. It says in the 10-step promises, we become neutral. We won't have to swear it off anymore, right? We will have a different opinion about it. We'll recoil from it, but the reason, as a hot flame, but the reason we recoil is because the change of thinking. It's not that drink became our higher, that heavy drink, laden drink with all that junk in it became our higher power, higher consciousness. I know how I could feel better, but what did it do to you? It created the psychological, it isolated us, and all the physical ailments, and distorted our bodies. So, all we have to do in this program is know the truth from the false, as it says in the doctor's opinion. And when we have that psychic change, we don't have to, with people, we don't have to go to figure out how I'm going to act with a particular person. How about this? Do you ever realize that when you're with people, if one person looks at you in a disdain manner, you sort of maybe get into yourself. Another person starts laughing at your jokes, you get happier. I mean, what's that all about? That's not being true to ourselves. It says in here, being honest and truthful. Just like with the food, why would I want all of that food to make me happy? Alcohol, the drugs. So when we get centered and we have that higher consciousness in, then it shifts because the food doesn't become the importance it had before. It loses, so we can recoil as a hot flame. We start to have spiritual bread, life, and enjoying things, and have that spiritual change, keep in fit spiritual condition. So if I'm ready to go back to my addictions, if I'm ready to get angry, resentful, or get fearful of a person, I can get back into fit spiritual condition by working these steps. So it says here, if you persist, remarkable things will happen. We're talking on page 100 when he has a newcomer. When we look back, we realize that the things which came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands were much better than anything we could have planned. We could have planned a big meal. We could plan to drink. We could plan how I'm at work and I'm at a meeting. I'm going to tell what people what to do, what not to do. Okay. All I have to do is pray, meditate, and go to God. And the answer I always get is that it really doesn't matter. So when it doesn't matter, then I could have that transformation. Then if somebody at work, let's take work as I could give you a million examples, but work could be one. They get upset with me. The boss wants to yell at me. And it says in this book, we only smiled. It says we had that spiritual, we rose above it. I think it's on page 55, and we only smiled at those who didn't believe. So with that God consciousness, again, and I use the example of, and a guy told me, he was from India. He said, when the elephant walks down the street and the dogs bark at the elephant's feet, the elephant doesn't pay any attention. So when we get this God consciousness, the spiritual transformation, then we live life like as a loose garment, become happy, joyous, and free. We become, even we were meant to be ecstatic. Even we were meant to wake up, and if we see the sunlight and the outdoors, that's what we're meant for. But we're the creators of our problems. It says on page 62 that if we have a problem today, we're the problem. If you're unhappy today, who are you thinking about? You think about the self, but the self is false. The self isn't true. It talks about on page 58 the word honest 3 times. So I always thought it meant giving somebody the right change. Being honest is knowing the truth. When I do these defects of character and I look at my shame, my envy, it all had something to do with the past. We learn in this program, it's in the present, it's in now, it's right here, the eternal presence with God. But if we do think of the past, the only thing I have to do in my life is just say, Bob, that's not true. The past could be an illusion. It doesn't matter. If I worry about the future. So I have these emotions and feelings, but when they come to me, I look at them. I say, okay, as like another person, because there's a human side to us and there's a spiritual side, the soul. The human side is false. It's a lower level of thinking. They talk about the devil. I mean, the devil came into your life, right? So why would we go there when we learn? But we didn't know the truth from the false. But now we know by working these steps that all these defects of character, understanding these things, what they are, is the road to recovery. Comprehension with, even when you're with a person, understanding why they act the way they do. It has to do with they're feeling hurt, so they try to hurt you. When we have this love, tolerance, and acceptance, but it has to be for ourselves too. If I feel angry right now and say, "Oh, I'm upset about this," I at least say to myself, I used to think it was a reality. If I had that was my spiritual awakening. I was driving my car and I had this resentment towards somebody, and I said, it just finally dawned on me by starting to work these steps. I said, I don't have to think that way, and if I do, why? What is it? And that's this whole universe, humility. That's what I needed. And it talks about that in 6, we need humility, willingness. And then 7, humility is because I thought I carried the earth around me on my shoulders, right? I didn't realize that I'm from dust. I'm going to dust. Humility is the key here. It's getting out of the self, the ego, easing God out with the addiction to the food. I'm telling you, and because that's a big one. It's the ego. I know how to solve my problem today. I'm going to eat more food rather than keeping in fit spiritual condition. But why did I read page 100? Because this is something that they're telling somebody to do with the guy who walks in the door. But how many years some of us are in the program? Are we doing what it tells us to do here? To work, be spiritually fit and work in the path of a higher power? God's hands were better than anything I could have planned. No, we're still planning it. When we try to diet, we're still planning it. We need that shift change. We're looking at the food and God's temple is our body. Follow the dictates of a higher power. God's will, not mine. My will says I want to go out and have maybe travel the world or get people to like me or have all of this food, have all this alcohol, have all this drugs, you know. But it says here, you will presently live in a wonderful world no matter your present circumstances. So here's about that shift, that transformation, that thinking, that spiritual awakening now. You want to live in a beautiful and wonderful world, or do you want to be into the self and the addictions? God created us in his image. We were made to be, there's no doubt about it. Again, like a child, or when we get out of self and you just think of the present, you got to be happy. That's the way we were made. Again, I use it like a child or a puppy dog. When we're out of the self, the whole world opens up to us when we get out of self. Everything, the creation, the joy, the bread of life, not the bread of our addictions. It becomes much easier then. So then, if I have to stay away as a hot stove, I'll say, well, why do I even want it anyway? Because we had the shift. Why would I want all that poison? Why would I want to bloat myself and what happens is that when we get centered, we even feel our inside, and that's why some people who are really centered, their whole lives, they stay the same weight, because our body has a built-in thermostat. But as soon as we get with the dying to try to do it on our self-will, the fear comes back in. All of a sudden we get fearful. Then we block out the sunlight of spirit. We block out the wanting to be, to not use food as a higher, as a God, because we're into this self and we're into the ego says, I'll figure it out through this food. Or if we can't resist it, we can't resist anger, we can't resist food, we can't resist anything in life. We can see it and observe it, because when we resist something, we make it a higher power. We make it more real. For example, if I go to a meeting or somewhere and I tell people, hey, I had a fight with my mother-in-law or somebody in my life, I'm saying it's a real thing. When I get centered and I think about it, I say, well, what does it matter what somebody says or think or does? They say, don't worry about what other people think, say, or do, right? Because it's insanity. Think about it. It's insanity to worry about what other people say, or even if they gossip about you, whatever it is. We have that sick man prayer, but when people do that anyway, if you want to look at it from a practical point of view, they really hurt people. If anybody was happy, they had the spiritual awakening, they go around hugging people and being happy, right? It's only so they're coming from. So when somebody says something to me, they're talking about themselves. They're upset with themselves. It has nothing to do with me. A boss at work's trying to impress on me that they feel I wasn't listening to them. I didn't understand them. So we can only sit there and smile. Sometimes, right, when I'm really spiritually fit, sometimes I try to stop. I'm almost break out laughing. Somebody's yelling at me and carrying on, and whatever it is, or people at work. We only can smile because it's not about us. That's the lower level of thinking. That's the pride. So, oh boy, time is going fast here. So anyway, the answer is within. And I just want to say on page 99, it says here, remind the prospect, this is the very beginning, that his recovery is not dependent upon people. It is dependent upon his relationship with God. So here, that's the whole spiritual awakening, to realize, to get out of the self, to get out of the ego. But again, I say this again, how many years have people been in this program? And that's why I say you can have that awakening right here, the spiritual awakening. But if we're going to try to figure it out, and like the doctor's opinion said, there's only one solution, a spiritual solution. And we agnostics says that there's only one power, and that's through a higher consciousness, right?